67% of Americans want legal limits on abortion. 62% call themselves pro-choice, the same poll, the same people. And depending on which news you watch, you either heard about this constantly or you never heard about it at all. I'm Claire Morgan, and this is the Mirror Moment podcast. Here's what just happened. On January 22nd, 2026, the Knights of Columbus and Marist poll released their annual abortion survey. 1,408 adults. Margin of error plus or minus 3.3%. And the top line number got picked up, at least in some places. 2/3 of Americans support placing legal limits on abortion. That's a supermajority. But here's where it gets strange. In that exact same poll, 62% said they're pro-choice. Only 37% said they're pro-life. Most Americans call themselves pro-choice. Most Americans want abortion legally restricted. At the same time, by significant margins on both questions. That's not a polling error. That's the data. That's what Americans are actually saying. And if you think that's confusing, wait until you see how the media coverage split. Because this single poll created two completely different realities depending on which filter you're viewing it through. If you hit subscribe right now, you'll catch every episode where we pull apart these differences in media framing. On the right, the story was crystal clear. Pro-life groups celebrated. The Daily Caller ran the headline, "Forcing doctors to perform abortions isn't as popular as Democrats think it is." Catholic World Report emphasized that only 37% of Americans identify as pro-life, but 67% want limits. Just the News quoted the poll director directly. Despite the publicly heated debates about abortion, there remains a consensus of opinion on this issue among Americans. The framing was consistent. Americans say they're pro-choice, but they don't actually want unlimited abortion access. The labels don't match the policy preferences. And look, that's not spin. That's literally in the numbers. 57% said they'd limit elective abortion to, at most, the first trimester. That's 3 months. Now, here's what you need to understand. As of this recording, no major left-leaning outlet, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, has published standalone coverage of this specific January 2026 poll. That doesn't mean they're hiding it. It means they didn't prioritize it. And that editorial choice is a notable editorial decision. When we searched CNN's recent abortion coverage, we found stories about shield laws and extradition battles. NPR covered Trump expanding the Mexico City policy to ban foreign aid to groups that discuss abortion. Real stories, important stories, but they're about policy fights, not about what Americans actually think when you ask them direct questions. And that gap is shaping public perception. If you want to understand how perception gaps like this shape political reality, hit that like button. Now, let's be clear about what the poll actually found. 84% of Americans support pregnancy resource centers, the places that don't perform abortions but offer support during pregnancy and after birth. 88% believe that laws can protect both the mother and her unborn child. 63% think healthcare professionals with religious objections shouldn't be legally required to perform abortions. These aren't close calls. These are large majorities. And yet, when you turn on cable news or scroll through your feed, you'd never know these views existed at scale. Because the public conversation about abortion isn't shaped by what most people think. It's shaped by which stories get amplified and which stories get ignored. Here's where it gets even more complex. This isn't the only recent poll on abortion. In July 2025, the Associated Press and Norty conducted their own survey. They found 64% say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. That sounds like the opposite of the Knights of Columbus finding, right? 64% want it legal versus 67% want limits. But here's the thing. When APNORC dug deeper, they found that support for abortion for any reason, at any time, dropped significantly. In 2024, 61% supported abortion for any reason. By 2025, that number fell to 52%, almost evenly divided. So even in a poll framed around abortion rights, when you ask about specifics, about any reason at any time, the consensus starts to crack. And if you're wondering why this matters for the midterms, for state races, for how politicians actually campaign, stay with me because this is building towards something most people never see. Let me tell you what didn't make headlines. The Marist poll director, Dr. Barbara Carvalho, said this. Despite the publicly heated debates about abortion, there remains a consensus of opinion on this issue among Americans. Americans believe abortion should be limited, yet include exceptions for rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother. She also said, despite the changes in practice that have occurred since the Supreme Court's landmark Dobbs decision, public opinion has remained consistent. Remained consistent. That's the key phrase. Because if public opinion hasn't actually shifted much since Dobbs, but the media coverage has exploded, and state laws have diverged wildly, and political campaigns have made this the central flashpoint, what does that tell you? It tells you that the conversation we're having in public may not fully reflect private views. The labels we use, pro-choice, pro-life, don't map cleanly onto the policy preferences people actually hold. And this is where the mirror moment begins to take shape because, depending on which media ecosystem you live in, you're getting a completely different emphasis about what Americans want. On the right, the narrative is often presented as clear. Americans want limits, they want conscience protections for healthcare workers, they want pregnancy resource centers supported. They're not as pro-abortion as the left claims. And all of that is backed by polling data. On the left, as of this recording, the story is about access, about shield laws protecting doctors who mail abortion pills across state lines, about the Trump administration's pressure to restrict mifepristone, about extradition battles between red and blue states. Also backed by real events, real legal cases, but missing the polling data that shows most Americans, including most who call themselves pro-choice, want some limits. Now, here's what makes this so complicated. Both narratives are true, and both are incomplete. The right is correct that most Americans want restrictions. The left is correct that most Americans oppose total bans and support access in cases of rape, incest, and medical necessity. These aren't contradictory. They're the same position viewed from different angles. But the way the stories get told, the headlines you see, the clips that go viral, they make it seem like we're in two different countries with two different populations. Let me share something else the poll found that received little coverage. 59% of Americans believe an in-person visit with a doctor should be required to obtain chemical abortion drugs. Only 40% said it shouldn't be required. That's a majority across the political spectrum. And yet, the Biden administration permanently eliminated the in-person requirement for mifepristone. The Trump administration hasn't reversed it. So both administrations, despite opposite political bases, have maintained a policy that most Americans oppose. Why? Because the loudest voices on both sides aren't representing the middle. They're representing the extremes, and the extremes get the coverage. Share this episode if you know someone who thinks they're the only one confused by how this issue gets debated, because they're not alone. Here's another number that should matter but doesn't get discussed. 54% oppose using taxpayer money to fund abortion domestically. 69% oppose using tax money to fund abortions overseas. These aren't fringe positions. These are majority views, and they cut across partisan lines in ways that don't align neatly with partisan narratives. Because if you're watching MSNBC, you're hearing about attacks on reproductive rights. If you're watching Fox, you're hearing about the pro-life movement's momentum. And both channels are telling their audiences that the other side is winning and that their side needs to fight harder. But the polling says something different. It says most Americans are somewhere in the middle, wanting access with limits, wanting exceptions with restrictions, wanting nuance in a debate that often leaves little room for it. Now, let me show you what happens when this disconnect plays out in the real world. At the 53rd Annual March for Life on January 23rd, 2026, Vice President J.D. Vance announced an expansion of the Mexico City policy, which bans U.S. funds from going to groups abroad that provide or promote abortion. The new version also bars funding to groups that promote gender ideology and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. That announcement got massive coverage on the left. It was framed as ideological overreach, as weaponizing foreign aid. On the right, it was framed as protecting life and American values. But here's what didn't get covered in either narrative. The underlying poll data showing that 69% of Americans oppose using tax money to fund abortions overseas. So the policy, at least on that specific question, aligns with what most Americans say they want. But you'd never know that from the headlines. This is the mirror moment. It's not that the facts are different. It's that the framing makes them difficult to reconcile. If you're in one ecosystem, you see a government crackdown on reproductive freedom. If you're in the other, you see common sense restrictions supported by the majority. Same policy, same poll, completely different realities. Let's talk about what the poll reveals about labels versus beliefs. 62% of Americans identify as pro-choice, but within that group, 48% still believe limits should be placed on when abortion is allowed. That means nearly half of people who call themselves pro-choice don't actually support abortion without restrictions. Meanwhile, on the pro-life side, 91% support placing limits on abortion. That's near unanimous. but only 37% of Americans identify as pro-life to begin with. So the labels are doing something strange. They're signaling tribal affiliation more than policy preference. You can be pro-choice and want first trimester limit. You can oppose total bans and still think abortion should be rare and restricted. But the public conversation doesn't have language for that. It often leaves little space for it. And here's why that matters. Politicians on both sides are playing to their bases, to the people who want no restrictions or total bans, because those are the people who show up in primaries, who donate, who volunteer. But those aren't the people who represent the majority. The majority is in the political center. The majority wants exceptions and limits. The majority thinks it's complicated. And the majority feels completely unrepresented by the debate they see on TV. Now, let me tell you what's missing. Historical context. The Knights of Columbus and Marist have run this poll annually for over a decade. Every single year, similar results. Majority support for restrictions, majority support for exceptions, majority opposition to both total bans and abortion on demand. But here's what changed. In 2025, 72% said abortion should be restricted at 6 months or earlier. In 2026, 67%. Still a supermajority, but a 5-point decline. Why? Maybe Dobbs made access feel more urgent. Maybe state battles made people more protective. But the decline is real. And it's the only number that shifted significantly year over year. Let me give you another data point that complicates the story. In September 2025, the 19th News and SurveyMonkey poll found something startling. Abortion as a top voting issue dropped from 7% in 2024 to just 2% in 2025. And among the small group who still ranked it as their top issue, 57% wanted abortion mostly or completely outlawed. That's a complete reversal. For years after Dobbs, voters who prioritized abortion were overwhelmingly pro-choice. But by late 2025, the most motivated voters on abortion were pro-life. That suggests the intensity gap is shifting. The people for whom this issue is make or break are increasingly on the restrictive side, and if that trend continues, it changes everything about how this issue plays in elections. Here's what I want you to consider. The data says most Americans want abortion to be legal, rare, and restricted. Legal in cases of rape, incest, and medical necessity. Rare meaning we should work toward having fewer abortions. Restricted meaning not available on demand at any point in pregnancy. That's the majority position. But when was the last time you heard a politician campaign on that platform? When was the last time you saw a cable news segment that represented that view? It's uncommon because it doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't fit the fundraising emails. It doesn't fit the 30-second attack ads. So instead, we get two stories. One side says Republicans want to ban abortion entirely, force women to carry non-viable pregnancies, and criminalize doctors. The other side says Democrats support abortion up until birth, oppose parental notification, and want taxpayers to fund it. And both sides can point to real examples, real bills, real statements that back up their claims. But those examples are the outliers. They're not the middle. And the middle is where most people live. Let me show you one more fracture line. CNN reported Louisiana is seeking extradition of doctors in California and New York who allegedly mailed abortion pills to women in Louisiana. Both states cited shield laws and refused. Louisiana's attorney general said she'll take it to the Supreme Court if necessary. Real legal battle, real policy. But here's the question nobody's asking. What do most Americans think about doctors in blue states mailing abortion pills into red states with bans? The polling doesn't tell us. The coverage doesn't explore it. We're watching a potential constitutional conflict play out, and we have no idea where public opinion actually is. Just assumptions based on tribal affiliation. And that's the mirror moment in its purest form. We're so deep into narrative-driven coverage that we've lost track of what people actually think. We've replaced polling with punditry. We've replaced data with emotion. And both sides are doing it because both sides benefit from the other being cast as extreme. Because if the middle exists, if most Americans actually agree on the basics, then the entire political structure built around this issue starts to collapse. The fundraising dries up. The outrage clicks disappear. The political incentives would shift. So here's what we're left with. 67% want limits. 62% call themselves pro-choice. 57% want abortion restricted to the first trimester. 84% support pregnancy resource centers. 63% support conscience protections. And major left-leaning outlets haven't covered it. Not necessarily suppression. It just doesn't fit the story they're telling about access under attack. Those stories are real. The legal battles are real. But they're not the full picture. And when you only show part of the picture, you're not informing, you're shaping. This is why we do this show, because the gaps, the silences, they're not random. They're editorial decisions, and those choices create two different perceptions. In one, Americans overwhelmingly oppose restrictions. In the other, Americans overwhelmingly support limits. Both can cite data. Both can show polls and headlines. But neither is complete. Neither fully reflects the middle. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a country where most people feel unrepresented, where most people think their views are fringe when they're actually mainstream, where most people believe the other side is winning when the truth is nobody's winning because nobody's representing what most people actually want. And that disconnect, that perception gap, it's not an accident. It may be reinforced by political incentive. It's how the system stays in place. It's how both parties can claim they're fighting for you while ignoring what you're actually saying. If this episode made you question what you thought you knew, drop a comment and tell us what shifted for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now because every week we're pulling apart these framing wars, these perception gaps, these moments where the story you're hearing isn't the story that's actually happening. This is the Mirror Moment podcast. I'm Claire Morgan. And the question isn't which side is lying. The question is what both sides are leaving out.